Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all. We made it through the semester or quarter or whatever you want to call it. As far as, I know y'all are meeting again next week, but this will be our last large group Bible study until next year, I guess, right? So we're continuing in 1 Samuel, and my talk today I'm entitling David's Enemies. Last week was Hannah's Prayer. This week is David's enemies, though we'll kind of have to look at some of the time before David with Israel battling the Philistines. But just to give you an overview and repeating what I said last week, Samuel is the third book of the section of the Hebrew Bible called the Prophets. It's in the section of the prophets known as the former prophets, followed by Kings, which continues the story of the kingdom of Israel in the land leading up to the exile. Samuel resolves the problem of the judges, which was in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. In Samuel, we get the first, and in 1 Samuel, we get the first and second king of Israel. 1 and 2 Samuel were written as one book. They were divided in half because of the length of the story. An easy outline of 1 Samuel is 1 Samuel 1 through 7 is Eli and Samuel. 1 Samuel 8 through 15 is Samuel and Saul. And 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 1 is the story of the rise of David and the downfall of King Saul. So, as I said last week, we looked at Hannah's prayer in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, spilling over into chapter 3 with the story of Samuel himself. That sets us up for the rise of King Saul and the various battles that Israel will face as they fight to stay in the land. And so my outline for today is I want us to look at Israel versus the Philistines, David versus Goliath, and then David versus Saul. And as I get into this teaching, remember 1 Corinthians 10:11. I've mentioned it several times over the course of this study, which says, "Now these things happened to them," talking about the Old Testament saints, "these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction." These things are always relevant for us, and I hope we'll see some of that today. So my first point, Israel versus the Philistines. The Philistines are one of the archetypal enemies of the people of God in the Bible. There are several of them. Egypt is one. Babylon becomes a really big one. That Babylon becomes such a big deal that even when we get to the book of Revelation, Babylon continues to be the archetype for the enemies of the people of God. Any worldly system that sets itself up against God, his Messiah, his people, is known as Babylon in the book of Revelation. Well, the Philistines are one of God's people's arch enemies preceding Babylon. From Judges to Samuel, the Philistines are the primary source of opposition to God's people, so they're important to the story. If you go back to Judges chapter 13 and the story of Samson, where the angel foretells the birth of Samson, I don't know if you remember, but this is Judges 13:5, the angel tells Samson's parents, or tells his mother, "Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall," keyword, "begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." So from Samson all the way through David, the major story is Israel versus the Philistines. Samson is beginning the work. King David is going to finish the work. Samson is a forerunner to King David. Now in 1 Samuel, after Hannah's prayer and Samuel being devoted to God's service, in chapter 4, Israel suffers a major defeat, 1 Samuel 4, at the hand of the Philistines. And the Philistines steal the Ark of the Covenant and take it into their possession, which is a major part of the narrative. So the ark is taken by the Philistines to the temple of their false god Dagon, and they put it up for storage next to their idol, and it leads to a rather comical story, though it's at the same time very serious. So 1 Samuel 5:1, let me read part of this story to you. "When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This was a sign of the impending doom of the Philistines, which continues to play out throughout 1 Samuel. They end up, experiencing various plagues because of the presence of the ark, and they end up basically telling the Israelites, take the Ark of the Covenant back. We don't want it. It's brought us nothing but problems. It's also interesting to note, I don't remember if your study book got into this or not, but Dagon, quite an interesting idol. And he has he pops up at various places in the Old Testament. So he was sort of a fish/reptile god. And a lot of archaeologists have found images. They think he may have been, like the idol of Dagon, may have been a merman. So he would have trunk up would be a man with a bronze helmet, and trunk down would be fish scales. Have a fish tail, like a mermaid, except a male mermaid, a merman. And what makes that, it's interesting for a number of reasons. One, because that imagery is going to come back up in 1 Samuel. We'll get to that later. But also, it sheds new light on the book of Jonah when you understand that, because the Ninevites worship Dagon. And so you imagine Jonah shows up, you imagine them hearing there's a guy who, a giant fish came to our shore and spit up this guy, and he's preaching wrath. If you're fish worshipers, you're probably going to be inclined to listen to this guy who came out of the belly of the fish. And even some scholars think the word Nineveh itself means basically fish town. The word's been lost to us in history, but I've read reputable scholars who believe Nineveh literally meant fish town because most of their economy was based on fishing, and they worshiped this fish god, Dagon. Now, back to 1 Samuel. So Martin Lloyd-Jones preached a sermon on the story of Dagon falling over before the Ark of the Covenant. It's in a book called Old Testament Evangelistic Sermons that I came across years ago, and it came to my mind this week when I was reading back through 1 Samuel, and I wanted to share a few things he says from that sermon with you. Just amazing sermon. He says, someone may be tempted to ask us, what has the Old Testament story of Dagon to do with us? What has it to say to us? What is the relevance to our position and condition today? And I think he preached this in the 50s. It was, if I remember, it's either the late 40s or early to mid-50s. He says, well, for myself, I see in that story a very great and important and vital lesson for the Christian church at this present hour. For what, after all, is this story? Surely it is nothing but an account of religion in a state of declension. It is religion and the God of the Christians apparently defeated and routed by the enemy. It is God and God's cause apparently completely routed and almost destroyed by the great traditional enemy. The enemy is triumphant all along the line and is rejoicing. He's relating that, he's saying, it's not uncommon for it to look like the church is losing, to look like God's people is losing. This movie's been played out before, and he knew that Christians felt that way in the 50s, and we tend to feel that way now. He continues. It is interesting to notice that it is a description and an account of the present situation down almost to the smallest and minutest detail. The church of God has been confronted by the attack of the Philistines in a very fierce and cruel manner for over a long 100 years. The form which the Philistines take is not always the same. Sometimes it is purely military form, but that is not always the form. The Philistines can assume many guises. They can appear in quite a variety of forms. And so he's using that imagery of the Philistines like Babylon, that they're symbolic of the attacks that are always coming against the people of God. So he goes on to say that in the modern world, what St. Augustine called the city of man, Babylon, those who are attacking God and his people, that the main forms of those attacks have not been military as much as they have been through philosophy, science, and politics. And he said this in the 1950s, I'm reminding you. Philosophy, science, and politics are the enemy's weapons of war. And he continues, quote, just as they are, these enemies of God, congratulating themselves, things begin to go wrong. This man goes into the temple of Dagon and finds Dagon on the floor. He puts him back into his place. It is all right, he says, carry on. But Dagon falls again and finally is destroyed. Lloyd Jones says, the history of the past 150 years in Western society is all the things that we've been propping up as gods have been continually getting undercut, and they're falling over. Back from Plato, and in Western society, it's been a huge thing. We said, if we just educate people, if we make education a priority, then we'll educate people out of their bad and out of their sin and out of their evil, and it hasn't worked. And you wonder, you say, our education system isn't what it once was? Well, yeah. We propped it up to be some kind of savior, and so ultimately it has fallen. We've made science in so many respects into a god. And what have we seen the last few years? Undercut, falling. The scientists we said they'll figure out how to fix all the public health problems, they'll figure out how to keep us all healthy, and we all live to be 200 years old. And then falls over on its face. Same thing with government. You make government into... C.S. Lewis has a quote in the Screwtape Letters. He says, you turn something into a god, it will become a demon. And that's what happens in idolatry. Dagon keeps falling on his face. This is the story of history. The things that appear to be defeating the people of God ultimately fall. But they fall in different ways. That leads to point 2. Let's talk about David versus Goliath. So when Goliath is introduced to us in 1 Samuel 17:4, so we're skipping way ahead now, it says, there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath. So Goliath is introduced to us, and it's repeated, I think, twice more in the story, that he is the champion of the Philistines. He is the Philistines boiled down into one mighty warrior who represents them. And I mentioned earlier that the idol Dagon being a fish or reptilian, a scaly creature. If you look at the description of Goliath, it's really interesting. This is 1 Samuel 17:5. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, which most scholars believe Dagon wore a helmet of bronze. You just Google Dagon, you'll see images of this. And he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Coat of mail, this is fun with Hebrew. The word there translated coat of mail, guess what it literally means? Scales. It's like fish scales or lizard scale, like an alligator, like a fish. Because a coat of mail looks like scales on someone. It's an outer covering of protection. So it's describing him like he's an embodiment of Dagon almost. He's this scaly creature with a helmet of bronze. And what is David going to do to him? He's going to chop his head off at the end of the story. He doesn't just hit him with a stone. He chops. What happened in the temple of Dagon with the idol Dagon is exactly what happens to Samson. He falls over and his head is chopped off. So one of the most interesting things about David defeating Goliath isn't just that David killed a giant. It's that David was a mighty warrior coming into this. We picture him as the little David boy coming to fight the giant. We don't know exactly how old David was. We just know that he was an unmarried young man. The term that's used it's sometimes lad in the King James that's used of David. It just means he's unmarried at this point. That's all that we know. So he may have been very young. He may have been well into his teen years. He may have been in his young 20s. Who knows? But we do know he's a mighty warrior at this point already, because when he comes to King Saul, you remember what he says to Saul, that he's killed bears and he's killed lions. I have never killed a bear and never killed a lion, and even with a gun. And David didn't have a gun. So David is no joke at this point, even though Goliath laughs at him and mocks him. But David, before this story in 1 Samuel 17, right before it, remember what's happened. David has been anointed as king of Israel. The Spirit of God has come upon him to equip him to lead the people of Israel as God's chosen king. And in David battling Goliath, what he's doing, even though he's not officially in action king yet, he's been anointed and he's taking that seriously. So the champion of the Philistines comes forward. Who should be the one to step forward to fight him? The king. It should be Israel's champion. It should be Saul. But Saul's neglecting his duties, and David is stepping up to the plate. So much so is David taking this position as king seriously, that after he defeats Goliath, this is at the end, so 1 Samuel 17:54, it says, after he chops his head off, David takes the head of the Philistine and brings it to Jerusalem and then puts his armor in his tent. I just learned this a few weeks ago. I keep saying it's interesting. This is fascinating to me. Jerusalem had not been conquered by Israel yet. The Jebusites lived in Jerusalem when David did this. The people of Jebus, that's what they were called. The city of Jerusalem was called Jebus, and it was inhabited by Jebusites. And so Gordon Hugenberger, who's an Old Testament professor at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, makes the point that this event is similar. He didn't say this exactly, but I'm making the connection in my head. Maybe you remember when we were looking through Judges and we talked about Samson ripping the gates of the city of Gaza up and carrying them on his back to Hebron. And I said when he did that, he was making a theological statement because God had promised Abraham, you will possess the gates of your enemies. He was saying, God's going to win. We are going to take this land when he ripped up the city. David is doing something similar here as he carries the head of Goliath to Jebus, which would become known as Jerusalem. And he's making a theological statement, essentially that, Jebus, you're next. I've defeated the champion of the Philistines. Some scholars think that David may have put the head on a pole and almost like a flag and stuck it in the ground on top of a hill so that the Jebusites could see what was coming for them. So Hugenberger also believes, and you'll find some reputable archaeologists who believe this too, that the place to which David brought Goliath's head came to be known as Calvary or as Golgotha. And it's interesting, even the name Golgotha, if you look at it, it sounds like Goliath's name, Goliath. Where was Goliath from? Gath or Goth, Goth. It looks like at some point in history the Israelites made a pun because if you ram Gaul and Gotha together, what you get is skull. You get skull. And some people think it's called the place of, in the New Testament, Golgotha is translated the place of the skull. Some people think it's because the hill maybe kind of looks like a skull. Hugenberger believes, and some archaeologists, that it was named this because it was the final resting place of the head of Goliath. And of course, it becomes the place where Jesus is crucified. So David crushes the head of the serpent, so to speak, and takes it to the place of the skull, where the very place where Jesus would ultimately crush the head of the ultimate serpent, the devil, Satan. So I give that to you for your meditation to think of the significance of this. But it's a beautiful irony. Again, you can research this. If it's true, it's another example of how God is an amazing storyteller. David versus Goliath. Here's number 3. David versus Saul. So David defeated Goliath in a matter of minutes. He's God's great warrior against the Philistines throughout his life, however, but he gets a new enemy who's not a Philistine, but instead is his predecessor, King Saul. From the moment David's anointed as king, Saul becomes his enemy. And David refuses to fight Saul because Saul is God's anointed. David believed until Saul died, he was not to fight Saul himself. So, example of this, 1 Samuel 24, verse 6, David said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, that I should fight against Saul. The Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." That phrase is repeated multiple times from 1 Samuel 24 on throughout the rest of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 26:11, "The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed." That's another example. So even while Saul's son, Jonathan, acknowledges that David is the true king, Saul spends the rest of his life trying to kill David. And here's a principle that we can learn from 1 Samuel, juxtaposing these various battles that Israel and David faces. You can apply this to the world. You can apply it to yourself. When it looks like the cause of God is failing, when it looks like the king is failing, Dagon is ultimately going to fall. Goliath is ultimately going to fall. Even Saul, the enemy from within, is ultimately going to fall. God is going to accomplish his purposes. We cannot be reminded this enough. Habakkuk 2:3. This is a great underlined, committed to memory verse. Speaking of God coming in judgment against his enemies. Habakkuk 2:3. "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. God's victories in the world and in our lives will come and do come precisely when they are supposed to come, and nothing can stop them, even though our experience constantly seems to militate against it. You imagine David. He takes down the giant 5 minutes, right? You know how long it takes for Saul to be out of the picture? 15 years. It's about 15 years. David's been anointed, and he's waiting for the crowns. This happens in nations. It happens in our lives. So back to the Habakkuk passage. And even David, I started to count yesterday. Let's see if I have it in my notes. I don't, but like you go through the book of Psalms, there's a familiar refrain that happens in the book of Songs, and it goes like this: how long, O Lord? I was looking, David used that phrase in his Psalms over half a dozen times. And you wonder if it was in situations exactly, oh, I'm running from Saul again. I'm having to pretend like I'm mad and in camp with the Philistines to keep this guy from killing me, even though I'm the rightful king. How long, O Lord? But in due time, he rose to the throne and became the great king of Israel. So there's a principle. God's purposes play out precisely in the way and at the time that they're supposed to play out. Sometimes it's short, it's very quick, sometimes it's very long. But I think that should be encouraging to us. I remember years ago hearing a sermon on the story in Matthew 9, and this story actually appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of the woman with the issue of blood who grabbed the garment of Jesus and was instantly healed. Well, in all three versions of that story, Matthew, Mark, Luke, this is the Matthew one, Matthew 9:20, it says, "Behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment." Why that little detail? She had suffered this for 12 years. Because the authors are telling us this woman had suffered for a long time, but Jesus could heal her in an instant, just in spite of that. And there's all kinds of stories like that in the New Testament. John 9:1 says, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and he healed him. Acts 3:2, the apostles saw a man lame from birth and healed him. Acts 14:8, the apostles at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth, and he never walked. Why these details? 12 years from birth, because it's saying it doesn't matter how long you've had the problem. If God chooses to fix it, he can do it in an instant. That's the point. You've heard of people who were overnight successes, no doubt. And, the common refrain you'll hear from overnight successes is that they had to work years to become an overnight success. Like the Beatles, for instance. They come to America and they're an overnight sensation. But they had been playing in clubs and bars throughout England for years, and done show after show after show, peddling away, working hard to become the overnight successes that they would become. And so I say all that to say, I'll say this individually to you. Whether you feel like you're fighting Goliaths or feel like you're having to outlast your enemies and you're saying, how long, O Lord? One of the great promises of 1 Samuel is Dagon, Goliath, Saul, they all, in the end, they fall. They fall. It may not be today, but it will be someday. But there's hope it could be today. And why can we say this confidently? Because of what happened at the place of the skull. Because the Lord Jesus Christ not only died to crush the head of the serpent, he also rose again from the dead. He didn't stay dead. When life feels like death, for the Christian, there is always hope of resurrection on the other side, because that's the great promise of the gospel. As Habakkuk said, still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. Wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. So King David was a dancer. Maybe one of the underappreciated aspects of his life, and you have to skip to 2 Samuel to really see it. But 2 Samuel 6:14, after another of David's great victories, He brings the Ark of the Covenant in. He defeats the Jebusites. He takes Jerusalem. He names it Zion. It's now the city of God. It's where God's temple will be built. It's where the Ark of the Covenant will have its final resting place. As the Ark of the Covenant comes into the city, 2 Samuel 6:14, David danced before the Lord with all his might. David wasn't always dancing, was he? He wasn't dancing when he stood in front of a giant. He wasn't dancing for 15 years when he was waiting for Saul to go away, trying to outlast his enemy. But on that day, he danced. And Psalm 30 may be the record of how David felt that day. Psalm 30, verse 11, he says to God, "You have turned my mourning into dancing. You've turned my sorrow. You've loosed my sackcloth, taken it off, and you've covered me with joy." I was telling my Sunday school class this past Sunday, we were talking about the glory of God and how God created us for his glory, and we glorify God by enjoying him. As John Piper says, God is most glorified in us when we're most satisfied in him. It's those dancing moments when God is peculiarly glorified, though our lives are not always that way. And I said to them, and I'm saying to you now, that I like to say that the Christian life should be like a musical, liable to break out into song and dance at any moment, right? Not all musicals are happy, are they? You got the downtimes, but then you've got those moments when suddenly the band strikes it up and everybody starts dancing. That's what the Christian life should look like. It's not all happy. And so I say, keep your dancing shoes on. You may not feel like dancing today, but who knows what may come with the morning. So keep the dancing shoes on. Let's pray. Father, I know that we may not have come into this place feeling like dancing today over slogging through 1 Samuel, but these stories were written for our instruction, and it gives us hope that some of the problems our society, our civilization face, and that we face as individuals, that even if Dagon and Goliath don't fall today, there's always hope that they will fall, because we know the end of the story. We know the one who died on Golgotha and rose again from the dead so that we could have salvation in him, and so that we could ultimately have hope, as the book of Revelation says, that there's coming a day when he will return and he will wipe away every tear and remove every sorrow in all of our days, as the hymn says. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we'll have no less days to sing your praise than when we first begun. So help us by your Spirit to keep our dancing shoes on. We ask in Christ's name, amen. Thank you all. God bless you. It's been a fun ride this semester. Look forward to the next.